Welcome to the Zen of Reffing Roller Derby, Lesson 23, Unsporting Conduct. I'm Axis Esteval, the author of this training manual. I'm filming this on June 19th, 2018. The content of this presentation is up to date as of this recording. Should this video become outdated or replaced by newer information, I'll put a link on the screen to where you can find more information. As always, you can find the latest version of the full training manual at www.tinyearl.com/zenreffing. Quick disclaimer. The WFTDA, MRDA, and JRDA are not responsible for the content of the training manual or this presentation, nor do they make any claims as to the accuracy of their content. Another note, if you spot any errors or outdated information in this presentation, please put a comment on YouTube explaining the issue and listing the time code. Lesson 23, Unsporting Conduct Penalties. All right, unsporting conduct is actually two different things. It's it's misconduct and it's insubordination. Misconduct and unsporting conduct are essentially synonyms. It's the same phrase. Misconduct is defined as undermining the legitimacy of the sport or displaying a lack of respect for the sport, its execution, or those that contribute to it. Whereas insubordination is a little more specific. It's willfully or neglectfully failing to comply with the instructions of an official or wrongful or improper behavior motivated by intentional disregard for the rules. Now, this penalty type here for unsporting conduct involves a significant amount of officiating discretion, and it's not limited to the actions that we're going to talk about. There are many crazy situations that can crop up in a game of roller derby, and they can be dealt with as unsporting conduct, or perhaps just with a warning to the teams not to repeat it, or can be treated as like an expulsion level unsporting conduct because it's an egregious or a repeated offense. You really need to use a lot of context and a lot of officiating discretion. We do not want to lightly hand out penalties, and we certainly do not want to lightly expel skaters from a game, but sometimes it's necessary to do so just because of a person's crazy behavior. One example, I'm familiar with a game where a skater decided to go and moon the audience. It was a jammer who pulled her pants down and she mooned the audience for most of the duration around the track. You're not going to find that anywhere in the rules of roller derby saying you can't moon the audience, but at the same time, it's clear unsporting conduct. It brings our sport into disrepute and is not appropriate. Are you going to just penalize someone? Are you going to expel them? Well, that really kind of depends on the context of the action. I mean, think about it. Was Girl Scout Troop 407 in the audience that day, and this was very much a family event? Or was this, a closed game, with a limited selection of, ticket holders, all of which were drinking out of an illegal beer cooler at the time, and, it was just all adults, and, the context of the game was a little different. In the former example, when there's a Girl Scout troop present, then you could consider this to be an expulsion-level action. In the latter context, you might say, well, maybe this is more of a penalty that the person committed, and with a warning that should you do it again, you will be expelled from the game. But if a referee was to say, well, no, I think both constitute a penalty, or both constitute expulsion, you're not necessarily wrong. There's no specific guidance on this. This is where you as officials need to use your discretion on making a decision how to enforce this. And again, when in doubt, let the head referee handle it. So, all right. Misconduct, as I said, undermining the legitimacy of the sport or displaying a lack of respect for the sport, its execution, or those that contribute to it. Here are some examples of misconduct. It's abusive or obscene language or gestures directed at a non-official. Like, no call would be like a minor slight inaudible to the audience expressed to a teammate or opponent. Again, we're not going to penalize a private conversation between two people quietly talking on the bench that are keeping it down, that a referee just barely hears out of the corner of their ear, but was not intended, for their audience. That's no call. Expulsion would be a long string of profanity or losing one's temper on the track. There's and I have expelled a skater, for this. Well, sort of. It was being directed at an official. See, if it's directed at a non-official, we call it misconduct. If it's directed at an official, we call it insubordination. And I had a skater that started arguing with me on the track instead of exiting for a penalty, so I gave her an additional penalty. I got that at the time. We used this hand signal, now it uses this. And she then just went and just gave me the finger and just stood right there holding it to me. And I, being head referee, immediately said, again, the hand signal was different at the time, just immediately insubordination, expulsion. And I expelled her from the game on the spot. We will take a certain amount of disrespect that we will issue a penalty for, but you can certainly cross the line into a expulsion level territory. And again, whether or not they're displaying this to an official or an audience member or such, isn't really the issue. It's basically, are they disrespecting other people, and they're doing so in a highly provocative, manner. Something else to consider too is who is hearing this, and what is the context of this. As I said, no call would be a minor slight that might be inaudible to the audience. It's also different than if the skater is, swearing loudly in front of the audience, versus totally lost their temperature and they've just totally losing it, in front of the audience. You could also take into account the context of, if a skater is injured, like, in one game I was at, a skater fell and she was hurting very badly and she was upset and she was swearing. I'm not going to penalize for that. Again, maybe the audience could have heard, but, and I know this because I have a degree in psychology, that swearing actually activates a part of the brain which is connected with pain management. So skaters that are, or people in general, if you're in pain and you start swearing, you tend to be able to withstand pain more than if you don't. So, I'm not going to penalize for that. On the other hand, I was also at a game where, the EMTs got over to the skater, and the skater was angry and goes, well, it's about fucking time you got here. That I certainly think would warrant a penalty over there. She is now being highly disrespectful to the EMTs, which were volunteers at this game, and, that would be a penalty level action. So, all right, another one, impersonating an official. And this actually is in the rules. There is a casebook scenario, and I'm pleased to report that I was indirectly in the process of getting this in the casebook, because I have a friend, hi Swiss, who was at a game where she's penalized. She arrives in the box. Now there's an opponent arrives after her. She stands, with less than 10 seconds left. She stands, and suddenly the other skater in the box, was like, I don't remember what her name was, but like green 1-3, done, and boom, she takes off out of the box, and immediately is issued a penalty box violation penalty because she left the box early without being released. And she's like, when she's given this penalty, she's like, but you told me, that I could leave, she says to the staff. And they're like, no, we did not release you. And it wasn't till, later she couldn't figure out, well, how did I hear this? The skater comes up to her after the game, was like, yeah, it was totally a dick move on my part. Sorry. I just meant it as a joke. I didn't realize you'd actually leave. And yeah, sorry about that. And, so the skater basically impersonated an official, got her penalized, and not cool. So in a case like this, we're going to penalize the blocker for impersonating the official, because again, the game of roller derby is not meant to include skaters in the box trying to psych out the other one into exiting the box and then get a penalty. So we're going to impersonate that blocker who impersonated the official, and we are not going to give her a penalty box violation penalty because she was acting on a good faith, she was trying to act in good faith, but she responded to a verbal instruction given, and we don't want to reward that person that impersonated the official. Otherwise, everybody's going to be trying to get the jammers released from the box by impersonating the officials, just figuring, hey, if I get a penalty, it's worth it to take her out with me. So, and mind you, my friend should have had to return to serve her unserved time. That's totally appropriate. But, not another penalty on top of that. Another one, hiding an active helmet cover during a jam. This is not the same as the skater kind of has it balled up in their fist a little bit and it's not immediately visible, which we can issue a warning, like Blue 27, show the star, and they have to reveal the star at that point. But if a skater is actively hiding in the middle of the jam, they shove their helmet cover down their shirt. I am far more concerned, by the way, with jammer helmet covers than pivot helmet covers, because there's no such thing as an inactive pivot. So all the team is doing is playing down the pivot, and later she'll have to get this out and put it back on her head to become the pivot. You might argue that some sort of advantage is being gained in there, and you're not necessarily wrong, but it's going to be a much smaller advantage than a jammer hiding their position, making their way through the pack, and then as they go around, they're pulling it out. So that is, That's an example of a rule that, by virtue of the rule existing, skaters are not likely to attempt it. So, but it's there, and certainly the penalty can be given on that if necessary. So, if somebody is actively hiding a helmet cover during a jam, an active helmet cover during a jam. So, next, reckless or negligent penalty box entry. And I don't mean a skater who comes sprinting towards the penalty box and at the last moment turns and does a transition and just breaks and sits down. And the box is going, whoa, I thought she was going to hit a chair. That's not reckless. She was in control of her actions and she made it. Nor do I mean a skater who slips on water that somehow got spilled on the track in front, because they have a reasonable belief that the track is in good condition, or that the rink is in good condition. If they hit a patch of water, that's something they reasonably should not have expected to be there. What I mean is a skater who is either just coming in too fast and just can't slow in time, or a skater who is just, coming in and they just trip and fall and just go sliding into the box and take out, several chairs. Now, the olden days of Derby, meaning 2 years ago, had very well-defined metrics for what constituted a penalty and an expulsion. The current rule set is a little less defined. You have more context. So, as a result, a lot of officials tend to still use the prior metrics, so I'm going to mention them here. The older metrics would be if a correctly placed opponent or NSO, and by correctly placed, I don't mean they're not supposed to be there, or they're not where they're supposed to be. A penalized skater who's told they can now stand anywhere in the box. That is correctly placed. But an incorrectly placed would be a skater who has gotten blocked out of bounds, for example, who has accidentally slid into the penalty box momentarily, or a bench coach that has entered to hand a skate tool or something, or hand a water bottle or something. That would not be a correctly placed person. But a correctly placed person who is forced to move to reasonably avoid being contacted. And again, I don't mean a totally exaggerated whoa, jump out of the way. I just mean they're whoa, they're going to get hit, and so they step back to avoid getting hit. That would be a penalty. What would not be a penalty is accidentally bumping into a teammate, because again, roller derby, we allow the abuse of teammates more than opponents. What would be expulsion level would be forcible contact to a correctly placed opponent or NSO, particularly NSOs because they're not wearing safety gear, caused by that reckless entry either by the skater themselves or they hit chairs and they have to avoid the chair. And these rules exist to protect the people in the box, because otherwise skaters are going to come flying in at high speed, constantly trying to just minimize that penalty time by that extra fraction of a second. There have been NSOs in the box who've had skaters have come flying in, hit a chair that bangs into the NSO's knee, and they've taken serious injury from this. I've never heard of a broken knee, but it wouldn't surprise me if it occurred, but I know they've been significantly injured in their knees before. So we want skaters to enter in a calm and controlled fashion. That can be fast, but they have to be in control of their actions. If they're putting other people in danger because of their desire to enter recklessly or negligently, that now is either penalty or expulsion level offense, depending on how it takes place. Attempting to deceive a referee into issuing a penalty. This used to use a verbal cue called embellishment, so you will hear this word used on occasion. Embellishment refers to a skater who they get blocked in the back, and a moment later they're like, oh, and they just fall down. But it's not related to the action. Soccer is infamous for embellishment. I'm going to see if I can grab a couple of clips real quick and throw them up on the screen so you can see what embellishment looks like in soccer. I don't have any examples from roller derby. This is a you'll know it when you see it penalty. So if you don't know it, you're not sure, assume legal intent as per the rules. All right, next up, we have blocking outside the acceptable range of the sport. And you'd think this would be illegal contact, which is like clockwise blocking and blocking while airborne and stuff like this. But this is designed to be a very vaguely written sort of phrase to give officials the discretion to enforce this as necessary. Now, something to keep in mind. A hard hit that is legal is not an expulsion or not a penalty. It is, if it's legal, it's acceptable. It doesn't have to be sporting-like. It doesn't have to be honorable. It doesn't have to be warranted. It can be completely gratuitous, but if it's legal, it is legal. So we would certainly not expel for that. However, there are certain blocks that they've come up with over time in roller derby that, while technically legal in a sense, have now caused significant problems. So, for example, the classic one, blocking while airborne, which we covered under illegal contact. And by the way, that one is sort of halfway between illegal contact and unsporting conduct, because whereas the rules preventing it are an illegal contact, the casebook scenarios describing the actions are an unsporting conduct. So if you call it as either in a game, you're not really doing it wrong. That's something rules needs to kind of clean up in the future. But if you're blocking while airborne, remember when a skater is airborne, they're considered to have their prior status on the track. So if you're inbounds and upright, theoretically, that blocking while airborne, you're in scouts and upright. So you should be able to legally block that way. That being said, it is dangerous to just go hurtling at high speed, jumping, even if it otherwise would have been a legal block, and just like nail an opponent in the side, and all your weight is crashing down on them at that point. So roller derby does not allow this. Non-forceful or unintentional contact with significant impact can be legal, and I don't mean unintentional in terms of like careless. I mean like, the skater, was making a jump, but the opponent then moved in front of them. So the opponent's actually the initiator, for example. That would be unintentional contact in this case. Or just non-forceful. Just you're jumping and just your shoulder brushes against the target. Again, we're not going to penalize for that. More problematic is intentional contact. And it's usually a penalty. You're jumping. You couldn't reasonably have believed you'll make that jump. You hit the skater in the shoulder. They fall down. Whether or not you fall down is irrelevant. That would be a penalty. Egregious would be like you just go right up to the line. Instead of impacting a blocker on the shoulder, you jump and just all your weight is coming crashing in on that skater. That would be an expulsion level action. Another example, positional blocking preventing a down skater from standing. Picture this. Black jammer falls on the track. Black jammer is down. They're down on all fours. They're going to start getting up. And suddenly white team gathers around them and all just start leaning in and putting their torsos above them. They've formed a cage around the person to the point where black jammer can't even stand, because in doing so, they have to make contact and they have to basically force the black blockers back so they can stand. They're basically blocking to gain a position on the track. Black jammer's stuck, and in theory, you could say, well, maybe black's teammates have to come and rescue them, but this is not what we want from roller derby. We want that jammer back up and in the game as fast as possible. So typically, you're not going to find this in terms of a whole team, but you might find this in terms of one skater comes over and they just basically form in an L shape and put their torso over the down skater. So if the down skater goes up, they're blocking like this. So as soon as they positionally block over the skater, unless it's just like a brief unintentional something and they move, but if they're intentionally doing it and they hold that position for a moment, that's a penalty. That would be unsporting conduct. You can't block a down skater from being able to stand in that fashion. Another one. Picture a down skater, and this has happened before in men's derby, where, and probably women's derby, but I'm not aware of a specific case, where the skater goes down, but they're not actually down. What has happened is they have managed to go into, picture like a handstand, where your hand, or I'm sorry, not a handstand, but like a push-up, where your hands are down on the track or something, but they managed to land with one hand down. Now, normally your back would be upright, so you can't be blocked, but there have been cases where the person has kind of gone over backwards and they managed to get one hand down and catch themselves. So they're actually not actually laying, they've got their skates touching the ground, one hand touching the ground, which is technically upright because one hand is not down, and their chest is up. Now the chest is a legal blocking zone, so an opponent could, in theory, just boom, and just come crashing down on their chest with all of their weight. That is incredibly dangerous. You would not want to be 1 foot above the ground with your chest up and have a 200-pound weight just dropped on your chest. We're not going to allow that in roller derby either. So intentionally falling on either a prone, which is not necessarily down, or down skater, that's an expulsion level penalty. Again, you could theoretically argue it's legal in this case, but this is an example where even though arguably in a sense it's legal, it is extremely dangerous, and we're not going to allow it. Another one would be pulling a helmet cover off an opponent. We will not allow that. Besides the fact that that's a high block, you got to make forceful contact to get that thing off. But even if you can do it, it is dangerous. You know, you're making contact with the opponent's head. We're not going to allow that. You pull cover off an opponent, you're expelled from the game. It's as simple as that. We're not going to allow. Now, this is not the same thing as, you know, you're in there shoulder to shoulder, but your opponent's shorter than you, and as part of this, your shoulder brushes against their helmet, and it just kind of pulls off their helmet cover, and it falls down. That is not the same thing. I'm talking about intentionally reaching out, grabbing the cover off their head. That is unsporting conduct of the highest order and warrants expulsion. Another thing now here, and this is where we're no longer here in blocking, failing to abide by the governing body policies during the game. What the hell does this mean? It means the three major organizations, Women's Flat Track Derby Association, Men's Roller Derby Association, Junior Roller Derby Association, all have a series of policies and procedures. And I don't necessarily mean the rules, but I mean, like, what are the policies that need to be followed in a sanctioned game? And, you know, for example, one of those for WIFTA, the WFTDA, is that you can have up to 4 bench staff, which, due to venue constraints, can be limited to 2, but it can never be less than 2. But you can have up to 4 bench staff. And I've seen this in a tournament where a team had the maximum number of bench staff, and suddenly they noticed another person on their team was down, somebody else had joined their bench and was now attending to someone on their team. And so between jams, you know, we do a quick, a timeout and go over and, hi, who are you? Why are you on the bench over here? Oh, I'm the team medic. I was attending to this person. Okay. Well, unfortunately, you're now the 5th person, and the team did not identify during a medic. I mean, we can certainly allow extra bench staff in certain cases. For example, a sign language interpreter for a deaf skater. We would not consider that one of their 4, and we would absolutely allow that. But these people should be identified at the captain's meeting beforehand. If the team had said, I have a team medic, they will be only there for medical purposes. They will not be providing any strategic advice. They will not be seated at the bench. However, if we have an injured skater, they may come in and may attend to the team. That probably would have been allowed. But the fact that they didn't disclose this, and now they've come down and they've sort of joined in the bench, that was considered to be too many bench staff, and they were issued a penalty for it. If nothing else, the fact that they hadn't disclosed it now required the timeout, so it delayed the game from continuing. So even if you want to argue, okay, it's not actually an unsporting conduct on the part of the team, it's actually a delay game penalty, fine, you can call it one or the other, but it had impact on the game. Another example, an ejected skater that interferes with subsequent gameplay. Now, ejected refers to both expelled skaters and fouled out, which we'll be talking about in another lesson, and they can go sit in the audience and they can watch the game. Well, while they're in the audience, they are allowed to interact with the game in the manner basically reasonable behavior expected from an audience member. Clap, cheer, yell, call off the jam, whatever you would normally allow an audience member to do. However, if they're coming up now and they think they're suddenly a turn coach and they're standing at turn 3 and they're attempting to influence how the game is taking place, if they're entering the track, between jams, giving advice to their team or during a timeout, advice to their team, no, that's not allowed. They have been ejected from the game. They are not allowed to participate. The fact that they're allowed in the audience is a courtesy. They're treated as an audience member. And if you're entering the track to talk to people between games, that's not what we allow audience members to do. So in that case, the team gets an unsporting conduct penalty. And by the way, when possible in all of these penalties, the penalty is served by the team captain. It's normally served by the responsible skater. But where that's not really a responsible skater, or they can't, because obviously it was the person that already fouled out, for example, then it's served by the team captain. So, and by the way, in the case of the ejected skater that interferes with subsequent gameplay, if they do interfere with things, like I said, penalty to the captain. But in that case, we're also going to banish the skater back to the locker room because they have lost their privileges of being in the audience at that point. So, another example of unsporting conduct, of misconduct. We got lots of examples here. Intentional, reasonably avoidable, and forceful contact to an official. What this basically means is skaters are not allowed to block the refs, or the NSOs. It's more commonly the refs, but it doesn't have to be. And we don't allow this. And certainly, they do make contact all the time. It happens. The skater's blocked out of bounds. There's a referee there. Boom, the two make contact. It happens. We don't penalize for that. What we penalize for is, like I said, intentional and reasonably avoidable and forceful contact. And I've seen this in a game, actually, where I was in, where I'm standing there, I'm in OPR, I'm watching the pack, and suddenly, boom! I'm completely barreled over from the back. I don't know what happened. It feels like I got hit by a Mack truck, and I am down on the floor. And I get up, and I just see someone kind of disappearing down the track into the box. I hadn't even been moving. Actually, I had been moving very, very, very slowly in the clockwise direction. And a skater just coming out of the penalty box didn't look where they were going and just completely barreled me over. That was an expulsion level action. Unfortunately, I didn't get the identity of the person, and I was too stunned to bring it up and too new. I was very new at the time to bring it up with the head referee between jams, so we didn't get the person expelled. But absolutely, that was an expulsion level action. Again, intentional or reasonably avoidable, so negligent essentially. Intentional or negligent, and forceful. If it's not forceful, they just kind of brush against you, not going to worry about this. I have seen in a game when a blocker, or I don't know, jammer, I don't know what it was, between jams, they're skating backwards, in the outside safety lane, and they're talking to one of their other skaters and such, and they suddenly turned around and they were, like to go to the bench, and they realized they're like 2 feet away and rapidly closing on a referee who's not looking at them. So they put their hands like on the referee, like, whoa, sorry, like, and it made forceful contact, but it was not intentional. Certainly it was reasonably avoidable. That skater going backwards over there, and they did make forceful contact. There's an argument there for expulsion. The counter argument might be that they were able to brace that referee in time. The referee did not fall down. They were immediately apologizing. One could make the argument to lower that one to a penalty, or that it still should have been expulsion. And I didn't find out about that after the game, so it wound up being nothing in that game, no call. But there would have been, at the very least, should have been a penalty issued for that. Normally, this is an expulsion level action. Had that skater not turned and instead just simply backed right into that referee and knocked them down, absolutely that would have been an expulsion at that point. So, by virtue of being in a game of roller derby, we understand there are certain safe places to be, not safe places to be, and sort of gray areas like the outside safety lane, which is safe to an extent, and you have to have a reasonable awareness of what's going on around you. However, between jams, when the bulk of the skaters have returned to the bench, all skaters are reasonably skating in a controlled fashion. They should be. At that point, you have a reasonable expectation not to be blocked, and that referee was then not constantly staring around them. So that would have been expulsion, or certainly could have been argued to be expulsion. And I want to throw one final one at you over here, which is, imagine a helmet cover falls on the floor, and it's a jammer cover, and an opposing blocker picks it up, and they throw it. And they just throw it into the outside safety lane. I would issue a penalty for that, an unsporting conduct penalty. You might argue it's illegal procedure that they took control of the opposing helmet cover. Fine, unsporting conduct, fine. Sometimes things are kind of more than once. And that would warrant a penalty. Now, if they took that same cover and they had thrown it into the audience, I would expel for this action. Simply because now they have involved the audience with the game. Between jams, no. At that point, I would have just said, okay, that's just a penalty and a warning not to do it again. But during a jam, they're throwing the helmet cover in the audience. I do not want jammers making their way rapidly through an audience trying to retrieve helmet covers. That is not where the game is supposed to be played. They are potentially putting audience members in jeopardy. Audience members should not feel like their safety may potentially be in jeopardy. So I would absolutely expel for someone throwing a helmet cover into the audience during a jam in progress. However, there's no casebook scenario on this. This is an example of where officiating discretion would lie, and I know referees that have said they would only issue a penalty for that. I can't say they're wrong. I can say I totally disagree. I say I think they're wrong, but they're not actually wrong, because they're allowed to craft the argument as they see fit. This is where officiating discretion comes into play, and I understand that not all referees are going to think as I do, even though I'm right. So, all right. Insubordination, as I said, willfully or neglectfully failing to comply with the instructions of an official, or wrongful or improper behavior motivated by an intentional disregard for the rules. Okay, this does not mean that a skater gets you get a forearm penalty and that's somehow automatically automatically insubordination, because they have intentionally disregarded the rules. Even if they deliberately did the forearm, they just thought, yeah, I'm going to knock her out, I'm going to give her a little push out of bounds, and I'll take the penalty, and it was well worth it. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about are things like Blue 27, return to the bench. And Blue 27 looks at you and says, no, and continues on in the game. They're intentionally failing to comply with the instructions of an official, and their behavior is improperly, and it's being motivated by an intentional disregard for the rules. Because that skater might have started the jam out of bounds, they entered the track, we ordered them back to the bench, and they say no, and they continue playing like that. At that point, immediate penalty, which they can't serve because they're not supposed to be in the jam, and if that skater even ignores that at that point, now we're going up to expulsion level insubordination, which certainly a skater can be expelled for gross insubordination. That's not at all where we're going to start. It's very rare. It can occur. Most commonly, insubordination is going to be willfully failing to leave the track in response to, or basically failure to leave the track after being repeatedly directed to do so. This could be because the skater doesn't hear it. The game is loud and such. So if you got a blocker on the outside who's moving counterclockwise, and you're the OPR and you're chasing them behind them, repeatedly yelling the penalty, that's not the same thing, because maybe that's loud, they can't hear you, maybe they're hard of hearing, in which case we try to identify them before the game, by the way, and we will give them a little bit more leeway on this. But ultimately, they being able to see your face, your body language, your hand signal, this helps them understand that they have been penalized. But other times, it's the front IPR, and you've got some blockers there that are clearly have the front IPR within their line of sight, and that front IPR is repeating the penalty over, and repeatedly. Remember, repeatedly in roller derby refers to 3 times, So by the time, that's more habitually, but same sort of thing in this context. But you have issued the penalty 3 times. You have used the proper verbal cue. You have used identified the correct skater color and their number. You have used the correct hand signal. You have used the hand signal in their line of sight where they reasonably should be able to see it. Your level of volume was appropriate for the context of what's going on at this point. Yes, at that point you can issue an extra penalty, the insubordination penalty, just because even if that skater's just in the zone and just isn't paying attention, at some point it's having impact on the game. Other times, the skater, you go to issue a penalty, say a back block, and the skater looks at you and goes, "Oh, me?" And you say, "Yes, you." "Oh, okay." And then they continue playing. Or they're leaving the track, but on the way off the track, they quickly give a block to another skater. So they did not just leave the track, they impacted the game as they were leaving the track. So once directed to leave the track, and once the skater is aware of that obligation, that is now their number 1 priority, with the exception of safety. I am perfectly willing to let a skater delay their exiting the track so they don't trample a downed skater. I'm more than fine with that. Similarly, if the person wants to just step aside and let some skaters go past them, so that way they can exit the track, without impacting the game, I'm fine with that as well. But I want them otherwise just reasonably leaving the track, making a good faith effort to leave the track in response to a penalty, and not impact the game and not jeopardize safety when they do so. Another form of insubordination would be abusive or obscene or profane language or gestures directed at an official. Mind you, this does not mean they need to be nice to the officials. This does not mean they cannot be rude to the officials. There's a difference between rude and abusive. Rude might be, okay, I think that that the calls that have been being made this game have been pretty terrible and substandard, and I don't believe this is the level of officiating that is appropriate for this game. That's their opinion. That may be somewhat rude to say that to the officials. I'm not going to give a penalty for this. If the person, on the other hand, comes up and starts screaming in my face, but even between jams, like that, that is now abusive. Abusive does not have to necessarily be the words. It can also be the tone. Again, just because they're getting snippy does not mean that they deserve a penalty. A simple warning can suffice in this way. Saying, I would remind you that when you're dealing with an official, you need to handle this in a calm and respectful tone. So please watch your language. That would be an acceptable warning. I know one referee that has said, and I think he's joking, that he goes like, because this used to be the hand signal for insubordination. You'd be like, nowadays you'd be like, like you're ready to call that penalty, and you're looking at him like that. That's probably not the best way to handle it over there. As tempting or as funny as that might be, not the best way to do it. If you need to give a warning, remind so calmly. Otherwise, they must deal with you, without becoming abusive, obscene, or profane in language or gestures. You have a fair bit of leeway on how you want to interpret that, but don't abuse that leeway. Skaters don't have to be nice to you. I was head referee of a game, and at halftime, I'm talking to one of the coaches, and I know the coach was having a difficult time with one of the referees, and the referee had somewhat of a track record of being difficult to deal with. The two of them were not getting along, and so at halftime, the coach is like saying, frankly, that referee's a bit of a, is being kind of a douchebag today, and I don't mean to be disrespectful by this, but I'm not going to penalize for that. He's dealing it in a calm, private fashion with the head referee. That was maybe not the most ideal wording. Certainly was insulting, but it did not, in my opinion, step over the line. So I didn't penalize for that. But certainly the skaters can eventually just, or a coach can trash the referee cue to the point where I will issue a penalty. But I really don't want to do this. I consider it, in some small manner, having to issue a penalty for this is a failure on the part of the officials. Now, that doesn't mean it's our fault. It doesn't mean that we could have avoided it. But in some small measure, that we want to keep the game calm and keep everybody getting along. We want to keep everybody working together to keep a nice game flow, a nice atmosphere for the game. And yes, sometimes skaters are going to explode. There's nothing we can do. But it does kind of represent an acknowledgement of the fact that we have failed to keep the game on that level. So I don't necessarily want to escalate this all the time by threatening penalties or giving out penalties. But absolutely, if a coach or a skater is crossing the line, I will do so. And as I said with that one skater that just stood in the track giving me the finger, I will expel them for doing so. There's a line they cannot cross, and when they cross that line, they're going to get a penalty. There's another line they cross, and when they cross that line, they will be expelled. Those lines are not written in stone. An experienced official will have a pretty good idea how to address these. But because there's so much discretion that's allowed to be given with this call, talk to other officials. Get other feedback. Take it to the head referee sometimes before issuing the insubordination penalty, particularly if you think that they're just being very abusive to you. I mean, yes, if they're screaming in your face, they're well over that line. But if their tone and their manner and some of their word choice is not cut and dried, but you think that they are crossing that line, take it to the head referee, and certain head referees will say, good, I will go issue, and they will go issue that penalty. Other head referees will say, I'm going to give them a warning at this point. If they do it again, you are to issue the penalty immediately. That's fine. You're covering yourself, and you're making sure that this is all that everyone is on the same page on your crew. And that is a good thing, because the last thing you want is the head referee having to try to walk you back at halftime. And I have seen this, by the way, in a game where I had a skater and a referee that just neither of them were having a good day, and both of them had just grown to loathe each other in the game, and they were both setting each other off, and they were both neither of them were de-escalating. Both of them were constantly trying to escalate the action against each other, to the point where I'm sitting there as the head referee going, why am I in this sport? I'm dealing with children, you know. So it's a lot easier for me as a head referee to defend my crew if I know my crew is doing everything they can to de-escalate the situation. But if they're not, the penalty is not your go-to choice. As I said, it represents a failure on the part of the officials. So that is not an ideal solution. Sometimes necessary, not ideal. So, and frankly, when the game is done, if a penalty has to be given to an official, to a skater or a coach for insubordination, for abusive or obscene language or something, I want it to be A, cut and dried. So if there's a grievance or something filed, that I am able to confidently say, that my official, was absolutely right in issuing this. And B, I want to be able to say that my crew acted in exemplary fashion. That I stand behind my crew 100% in how they addressed those situations during the game. I don't want to have to say, yeah, and I have a referee, and I asked him 3 times, let's tone it down, let's calm it down, and he did not, and just kept escalating it over there. So, frankly, I'm not going to defend this referee, and maybe the penalty was technically correct, but it should have been avoidable. The goal is not to goad someone into committing a penalty so that you can penalize them on it. So, ultimately, in that case, neither the skater or the referee was particularly in the right, and I wasn't pleased with either. So, but anyway, fortunately, those are rare. Unsporting conduct in general is fairly rare. You will not see these called every game. Insubordination, sometimes. By the way, one option of willfully failing to exit the track in response to a penalty is the skater decides to just head down the straightaway. They need to exit the track at the first legal opportunity. We give them a little leeway, particularly if they want to not impact the game, but also just simply because they take a couple of steps diagonally instead of going exactly 90 degrees off the track. Fine, but only to a point. If the skater just goes down there the entire straightaway and is cutting that, cutting the apex, cutting across the apex because they want to totally minimize their distance to the penalty box, that is impacting the game because they're essentially cutting their penalty time at that point by several seconds by going to the box in that way. So that would warrant a penalty as well. But that type of penalty will be somewhat common for insubordination. Every game or 2 or 3 you'll see it. The rest of the unsporting conducts in insubordination, very rare, maybe 1 out of every 10 games or something like that. And I'm glad, because I don't want to see any of these penalties issued. These are not, cutting the track, it happens. Everyone knows it. Okay, we deal with it. I don't want to see an unsporting conduct penalty issued because it just means somebody did something really sucky and it was not good. It was just not good for anyone involved. So, anyway, that concludes my lesson here, lesson 23. We'll be back in lesson 24. Expulsions and fouling out. Thanks.